Okay, Mr. Lance here. Causes of the Civil War, lesson 3A. Here we go, diving into our next big event today. That's the Lincoln-Douglas Illinois Senate race debates of 1858. Before that, a reminder, the Civil War's cause, underneath everything, as I will prove to you again today, is slavery, 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 slavery. Remember, you're going to run into people in this world that believe slavery is not the cause of the war. Now, don't be a jerk to them. Be graceful, be kind, but remember this. They're wrong. Slavery is underneath everything. Slavery is this wedge. Slavery is the wedge that drives a nation apart. It's under every law, every event, every action, the fear of it, the protection of it, the spread of it, the prohibition of it. We'll see it today, again, in our Senate race in Illinois. There's your metaphor, your wedge, driving into that log, splitting it apart. I thought a timeline will be helpful, so I spent some time pulling together some graphics and this timeline in PowerPoint. I think that will make sense, just where we've been heading. Missouri Compromise, 1850. I know, Mr. Lannis, the distance between 1821 and 1850 is not actually sequential based upon the... Yes, I understand. Hang with me. 1850, there's Henry Clay. We saw that, 4 parts of the Compromise. Which kicks off Fugitive Slave Act, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harry Beecher Stowe. There she is with her book. We saw Kansas-Nebraska Act by our main man, Stephen Douglas. We then got Bleeding Kansas in Congress. That's John Brown. Also Charles Sumner beating. We saw Dred Scott last time. Here we are today with the Lincoln-Douglas debates of the Illinois Senate race. So I think the timeline is helpful to you and helpful to me as we think about building our case leading up to war. Of course, I got some room left. We got some stuff to get to cover, but I think this is helpful, a visual as we move to war. Our question today, how did Lincoln-Douglas Senate race of 1858 increase tension between North and South? It's a great question. How would a Senate race in Illinois increase regional tension? Right? Here's what we're going to see. The debates, a series of debates. Lincoln is going to challenge Douglas to a series of debates. It's a brilliant move. Lincoln was a fantastic orator. These debates are going to take place. Think of it like a modern day, TV debate. People will travel in by the thousands. We have records up to 10 to 20,000 people will take the railroads and travel to these cities in Illinois to see them. These debates are then printed in the newspaper and they're spread around the country. And what happens is it brings the morality of slavery even more into sharper focus, right? Even more into relief, just like we've seen with the Fugitive Slave Act. And also at the same time, it makes Lincoln famous primarily for what the South believes to be is his anti-slavery sentiments. Now, he was against slavery, as we'll see in some areas, but not in others. I'm going to talk later about Lincoln's progression, his growth, his transition from his slavery thoughts and thoughts on equality. But what happens is the South begins to believe that he's against slavery. He becomes a prominent member of the politics in the North, and we'll see that in a little background. But again, this race sort of highlights a huge figure and sort of becomes a focal point of the nation's debate over slavery spreading in the West, particularly. Okay, we can never forget about slave power, especially today, because here's what we remember: slave power, the belief that a small group of rich Southerners are manipulating the national government into protecting and expanding slavery. Remember, we have no evidence this existed, but people believe that it existed. Even Lincoln will see today. Why does that matter? Because 2 key figures from the past are going to reappear in the slave power debates today. Stephen Douglas, remember Kansas-Nebraska Act. He wanted the railroad to go through right across the West. That allowed Kansas, Nebraska to become states, but slavery was open there. It led to tons of violence. He was accused, we'll see today, he's going to be accused by Lincoln of being part of the slave power, along with our main man, Chief Justice Roger Taney. He's going to be accused as well, remember Taney, of the famous Dred Scott case, where Taney said slaves and African Americans were not meant to be citizens. He essentially rewrote 80 years of history, the common law, by saying that the founders never meant them to be included, therefore they couldn't be included. Therefore, Dred Scott, you're not free because you're not a citizen. You can't even be in this courtroom. And he said the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, which allowed slavery to spread everywhere. These 2 guys are going to become a focal point today of the slave power. Remember, just because something's not real doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact. People believe it's real, therefore it has a huge impact. Okay, a little background on Lincoln. We're not going to go full. We could spend weeks and weeks and weeks and months and years and decades. People have done that about Lincoln. Our focus is some short biography. He's born in Kentucky, so right, slave state. Grew up in Indiana. Yes, Indiana, Illinois. These are northern states and free states. However, they're on the border, so there's a history there of slavery. He's a store owner. He's going to become a lawyer. He's going to become then a politician. First in the local, he's going to be an Illinois state congressman. Then he's going to progress to a U.S. congressman. And then in 1858, the Republicans are going to choose him to become the nominee for the Republican Party to challenge the Senate seat, which is Senator Stephen Douglas. So we know. So again, some common figures here coming into meeting place in 1858. Okay, that's Lincoln's sort of rise. Now, again, one of my favorite books I've ever read about Lincoln, and one that I will quote from in future lessons, by amazing super nerd historian Eric Foner. Eric Foner is a prolific writer. He's a historian from Columbia University. He's incredible. His book, The Fiery Trial, probably the best, I think, book about Lincoln's presidency in this time period, the Civil War, particularly his progression on slavery. Foner has an incredible sort of overview of Lincoln's growth, which he would call it Lincoln's adaptation, about his changing views on slavery and how they grew before, during, and after the war. Incredible. We're going to quote from this book. We're going to use it in our study. But I want to highlight, if you want to read more about Lincoln and his growth, his view on slavery and his progression and his speeches, check out this book. It's super nerdy. My students, I have it in my room. You can borrow it. It's really important, though, I think, to see people's opinions change. Lincoln changed. The country changed. We're in a time of change. This book is a great example of that. Okay, so Lincoln accepts the nomination and gives a very famous speech called the House Divided speech I have my citation down there, Springfield, Illinois. This is in June. He accepts the nomination. Here's what he says. A house divided itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. We've been talking about our country leading to this cliff edge. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or the other. He goes on. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, meaning stop it, okay? Or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become lawful in all states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Lincoln is essentially putting into words what Taney's decision said. If the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, if you cannot ban slavery below the 3630 line, well, then you can't ban it anywhere. You can't ban it in Pennsylvania, where it's technically against the state law. You can't ban it in Massachusetts. You can't ban it in those places. It's juridically, if that's a word, judicially, it's correct. It has yet, though, to sort of become this law that slavery is allowed everywhere. Up to now, the states, based upon their own laws and sovereignties, have been able to outlaw slavery in their own territories where they have power. Okay, so Lincoln, we said, is challenging Douglas for his Senate seat. Right? Remember, the senators are the most powerful. I would argue the congressmen, there are fewer of them. And so the senator is a big seat. He's going to challenge Douglas. And what Lincoln does is he challenges Douglas to public debates. Here's a map of where the public debates took place. You can see, and there are extensive primary sources you can find all over the internet. I'm going to quote from some liberally. I'm going to use some paraphrase. You can check them out. There's so many nerdy websites about Lincoln. You can find these. But this state and this map and these cities become the capstone of these debates. Debates back then were very different than they are today. The first person to go would have about an hour. The second person would have an hour and a half, and then the person who started would then have a half hour to close. It was much different. It was a lot more memorization. You might have notes with you. It was a lot more oration than it was back and forth, like ba 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 ba, like it is today. But these debates were heavily attended. We had thousands and thousands of people, newspaper reporters, widely printed. And it's such a great primary source record we have of these debates. I'm going to show you the main points and paraphrase and explain why this increased tension. Okay, so here's some of the main arguments made back and forth by these two guys. We're going to start with Lincoln. Lincoln is going to come out of the bat and say slavery is morally wrong. He's going to make that point, okay? That wasn't necessarily, now the South will argue against that, but this is a huge part of the argument, right? That's the foundation. This is what the nation's coming to. Now, Douglas is going to argue, no, it's not right or wrong. Remember Lincoln's previous statement, if slavery isn't wrong, nothing is. Douglas will say, well, wait a second, it's not wrong. It's up to the states to decide, right? It's a common argument made today about different topics. Well, it's up to you to decide. No, Douglas says it's not wrong. It is what it is. Lincoln says, no, it is a moral issue. Okay, next up, Lincoln says the Declaration was written to apply to all men. So he's contradicting what Taney had just ruled. Douglas says, no, the Declaration was written by white men for white men. He's supporting Taney's decision and his interpretation of what the founder said. Lincoln says, here's the slave power, you conspire with Chief Justice Taney to spread slavery. You're in on it, right? So here's America's conspiracy theory. We love it. He accuses Douglas of being part of that conspiracy theory. Douglas says, no, I did not conspire to spread slavery. There's no such thing. You're making it up. Lincoln says, you want to nationalize slavery. That's why you did that Kansas-Nebraska Act. You want to spread it all over. You're part of it. That's slave power. Douglas says, oh, yeah, you're a radical abolitionist, which would have been a serious piece of shade back then. You want to get rid of slavery. He's accusing Lincoln, who at this time does not want to get rid of slavery, of being secretly a radical abolitionist. Lincoln's also, Douglas will accuse him of wanting racial equality. Lincoln says, I do not want racial equality, right? Some of you may be surprised by that. Remember, though, this idea of growth. Lincoln is going to grow in his opinions, right? Even when slaves are going to be freed, Lincoln doesn't think that they can be reintegrated into society. He has a plan of wanting to recolonize them in Africa. Remember, don't judge people. Don't fall prey to presentism, judging people for the beliefs in 1860 that you might have today. We have to be careful of the context in which we're looking at this. So Lincoln says, no, I don't want racial equality. I just think that there shouldn't be these debates are going to culminate with Lincoln losing. You say, Mr. Landis, how can that happen? He should have won. Remember, it wasn't that Lincoln won or lost. It was that he became known and his beliefs about slavery became known. And the Republicans were like, man, this guy's pretty sharp. This guy has the ability to debate. This guy has the belief system that encapsulates the new party. This guy, he's the guy. He's the guy. So as newspapers print these debates, as word spreads, as Lincoln becomes a national figure, he skyrockets to fame. He loses. Doesn't matter. He becomes famous. A great cartoon here about how this sort of tore the nation apart. You can see here, we're going to be looking at the election coming up that's going to happen. You've got our different figures here that are going to take part in the election of 1860. Here's Lincoln, right? Here's Douglas. You got our two other candidates, Breckinridge and John C. Bell. We're going to look at those guys. The nation is going to be ripped apart by this issue, geographically, regionally. That's what's going to happen. And this race is what catapults Lincoln to fame. Okay, so to sum up, how did Lincoln's Douglas debates increase tension? Because it brought the morality of slavery into clear focus, and it makes Lincoln famous, along with his belief that slavery, at least, should not spread west. And he adds fuel to the fire of the slave power, and he sort of becomes, his arguments become household arguments. And again, remember I talked about that metaphor of approaching the cliff edge. America is coming to a point where people are having to look over and realize slavery is wrong. This country can't go on like this. Also, half slave, half free. We've got to arrive at a point where it's either wrong and we get rid of it, or it's not wrong and we allow it, or it's wrong and we allow it, and this is a nation of slavery. We're arriving at that point. And this is a huge piece of that. Okay, see you later.